In this video, we will learn more about JavaScript promises. Promises is a concept that has been made complex by every single one who explains it. In this video, I'll try to simplify promises for you as much as I can. You must have seen .then and .catch in other people's code in JavaScript, and you might have no idea what's going on. That's a promise in action. In this video, I'll explain what a promise is, how it works under the hood, and how to use it with a real example. So, what is a promise? A promise is just a placeholder for a value that isn't available yet, but it will soon be. To understand this, let's take the example of ordering a food from a restaurant. So, when you place an order, that's pending status, which means you're waiting for your order to arrive. But then when your food arrives, that means the promise has resolved, which means consider it with data. A data that is yet to arrive and you're waiting for it, that's a pending state. But when your data has arrived, that means that your promise has resolved. Now there's another example. What if you go to a restaurant and you order a pasta? If you order a pasta, that's pending status. Your food arrives, that is your pasta arrives, that means your promise has resolved. But what if they say that they're out of pasta and they won't be able to give it to you? That means that the promise has been rejected. So for example, if you're trying to hit an API and the API returns the data, it means that the promise has been resolved. But if for some reason you don't get the data, it means that your promise has been rejected. Let us try to understand this with an example in our code. So we will be creating a function that has a promise in it, and that when resolves would return some user's data to us. So let's get started. I'm making a function get user. Now this function returns a promise. Now as I said, there are two important states. One is resolve and the other is reject. Now what happens during this state? So I will be logging fetching user. This will log when the promise is neither rejected nor resolved, which means that the promise is pending. So this should log right away. And then I want to simulate a 2-second delay. So to do that, I'll be using a set timeout. If you use an API, there is usually a delay. You don't get the data quickly. So I'm just trying to simulate that delay here. So I write a set timeout. And we're assuming that the success is positive, which means we get the data. So if we get the data, which is always going to be true for now, we will resolve the promise. And once the promise resolves, it must return some data. So we will be returning data of some user here. Alright, and so we get the name of the user and we get their age. This happens when there is success. But what if there is no success? In that condition, the promise would be, we would want to reject it, and we would want to reject it with some message. That message would be user not found. So we've seen the scenario of pending, we've seen the scenario of resolved, and this would be the scenario when the promise is rejected. Alright, and as I said, I want to simulate a 2-second delay, so I would be adding the timeout time here. And now this will be called from somewhere. This is just simulating a real API, when we call get users, it immediately returns the promise, and that goes in the pending state. Now until those 2 seconds are up, the promise is pending. It's waiting for a response from the server. So what happens when we call this? Let us call this function. So I'm calling the function get user, and now what happens when, now it's either going to return the resolved state or it's going to return the rejected state, and I need to handle those states here. To handle the success state, I would have a then callback, and the then callback would get the data that is being returned here. So I'm going to store it in a variable called as user. And then what happens? What do I do when I get the user? I'll just simply log the user for now. You can do whatever you want to do in your use case when you get the data from the promise. So I'm just logging the user if I get the user in the resolved state. So ideally this is handling the resolve, but ideally this is where the promise gets resolved in reality. And then what do I do if it is not success? In that case, I would need a catch callback, which would receive this message. Basically, this would be any error that the server gives me. So I'll store it in a variable called error, and then I need to handle that error. You can show a toast message to the user, or you can log it in the console, or you can handle the data in your application any way you want. For now, I'm just logging the error, and this is my rejected state. Alright, now apart from then and catch, there is one more callback that each promise returns, and that is finally. Now finally gets called irrespective of whether the promise gets resolved or rejected. It gets called all the time. So if you want to do something in your application that doesn't depend on whether the promise was rejected or whether the promise was resolved, you can do it in the finally callback. So here I'm going to just log that the request has finished. This, always keep in mind that this runs all the time, then runs only when the promise is resolved, and catch runs only when the promise is rejected, but finally runs all the time irrespective of whether the promise is rejected or resolved. Now to see all of this with a real world example, in one of my videos I had done a fetch API call to get a random quotation from this API that is publicly available. So this is an API call, and it gets handled with the help of promises. So I have a then callback here in which I'm getting the response. If the fetch returns a success response, I need to resolve it with the help of then, which means I'm getting the response and I'm converting it into JSON format to then further utilize it. And then here in this response, here in this data, I'm going to get response.json's value, and which means that the data might have the content that the API returned, which means that the quote itself. So here I can get the quote and display it wherever I want. But if the API returns an error, then the catch callback gets called, and then I need to handle the error somehow. It can be either by showing a toast message to the user, showing an alert pop-up, or showing a log in the console. Here I'm basically showing a log in the console. So this is how promises work in practice. That was all for this video. Subscribe to this channel to get more such quick tutorials on JavaScript.